blood tasted like copper and regret. Nora swallowed the metallic tang, her teeth sinking deeper into the soft tissue of her cheek. Across the mahogany desk, a man bought her life for the price of her father's accumulated debts. Roman didn't gloat. He didn't sneer or look at her like a piece of meat. He just signed the leather-bound ledger with a heavy fountain pen, the sharp scratch of the nib deafening in the suffocating room. It wasn't a proposal. It was an acquisition. Alex's knee bounced under the table. The friction of his cheap polyester trousers rubbing against the chair leg produced a faint, pathetic squeak every few seconds. Nora stared at that knee. It was easier than looking at his face, which was slick with a greasy layer of stress sweat. It was infinitely easier than looking at the man sitting opposite them. The air in the office smelled of expensive cigar ash, floor wax, and the sharp, sour tang of her father's terror. 2.4 million, Roman said. His voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. It was a low, textured gravel that made the two massive men standing by the door subtly shift their weight in deference. That is the figure, Alex. Plus interest. I know, Mr. Gallo. I know. Alex's voice cracked. He reached up, pulling at the collar of his shirt, as if the fabric were actively strangling him. I just need another month. The docks are opening up. I have a shipment. You don't have a shipment, Roman interrupted smoothly. He closed the ledger. The dull thud sounded like a coffin lid dropping shut. You have a gambling problem. You have a second mortgage on a house that is already in foreclosure. You have nothing left to leverage. Nora kept her hands folded in her lap. Her fingernails dug half-moons into the cheap denim of her jeans. She felt a detached, clinical sort of nausea. This was the end of the line. For years she had patched the holes in their sinking ship, working double shifts at the diner, hiding the mail, intercepting the phone calls from men who spoke in polite, terrifying threats. But she couldn't patch a $2 million hole. Roman shifted in his leather chair. The leather groaned softly. For the first time since they had been escorted into the dim, wood-paneled office, his dark eyes slid past Alex and settled on Nora. She braced herself. She expected a leer. She expected the predatory gaze of a man who owned the city's underground, a man who built his empire on extortion and blood. Instead, his gaze was agonizingly blank. He looked at her the way one might inspect a load-bearing wall before buying a property, assessing, calculating. I have nothing left to leverage, Alex echoed, his voice dropping to a wet whisper. He was crying now, fat, humiliating tears tracking through the grease on his cheeks. You have one thing, Roman said. Nora stopped breathing. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway outside seemed to amplify, buzzing violently in her ears. Nora, Roman said. It was the first time he had spoken her name. He didn't drawl it out. He stated it as a fact. 24. Clean record. No attachments. She marries me, the debt is wiped. Clean slate, Alex. Alex's head snapped up. He looked at Roman, then at Nora. The most horrifying part wasn't the proposition itself. The horrifying part was the split second of relief that flashed across her father's face. He didn't jump across the table. He didn't shout that his daughter wasn't for sale. He hesitated. That hesitation broke something fundamental inside her chest. A quiet, dry snap. You want to marry her? Alex stammered. I need a wife, Roman said, picking up a heavy glass tumbler of water. Condensation dripped onto the mahogany. My associates prefer a family man. It projects stability. I require a legal spouse who will not ask questions, who will attend the necessary functions, and who will remain entirely loyal. In exchange, your debt is erased, and you never step foot in this city again. Nora finally looked up. She met Roman's eyes, They were the color of wet slate, impossibly dark and completely unreadable. He wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly over broad shoulders, the fabric absorbing the dim light of the room. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a businessman closing a difficult quarter. "I'm in the room," Nora said. Her voice was raspy, unused for the last hour. "You can speak to me." Roman's gaze sharpened slightly, a minuscule shift in the architecture of his face. "I am speaking to whoever holds the debt, Nora. Right now, that is him. If you agree to this, the debt becomes yours to pay. With your life. And if I say no, then I take his." He said it without malice. It was simply math. Nora looked at her father. Alex was weeping openly now, his face buried in his hands. He was pathetic. He was weak. He had ruined her life piece by piece for a decade. But he was her father. She looked back at the man across the desk. She noticed, bizarrely, that Roman's cuffs were slightly frayed at the edges. A man worth tens of millions, wearing a shirt with a frayed cuff. It was a jarring, intensely human detail that threw her off balance. "Fine," Nora said. The word tasted like ash. "Draft the papers." The silk was too stiff. It scratched against the sensitive skin of Nora's collarbones, raising a faint rash that the makeup artist had tried and failed to cover with heavy powder. Nora stood in front of the full-length mirror in the church's holding room. The room smelled of melting wax, hairspray, and the dusty, decaying odor of old hymnals. The dress was a monstrous creation of heavy ivory satin and rigid boning. It didn't feel like a wedding gown. It felt like a beautifully tailored straitjacket. "Hold still, please," the seamstress murmured around a mouthful of pins, yanking at the hem. Nora didn't move. She couldn't feel her legs anyway. The adrenaline had burned out of her system somewhere around 3 a.m, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell. She was a ghost, attending her own funeral. There was a polite rap at the door. One of Roman's men, a brick wall of a human named Matteo, stepped inside. He didn't look at her in the mirror. He looked at the floor. "It's time, miss." "Thank you." Her voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from a radio in the next room. She walked out into the corridor. There was no father to walk her down the aisle. Alex had been put on a train to Florida 3 days ago, his pockets lined with exactly $5,000 of Roman's money and a promise of a bullet if he ever returned. The cathedral was cavernous, drafty, and entirely empty, save for a few of Roman's lieutenants sitting in the back pews like gargoyles. The air was frigid. Nora shivered, the cold sinking into her bones as the heavy wooden doors to the sanctuary creaked open. There was no music, no organ playing a triumphant march, just the hollow echo of her white satin heels clicking against the ancient stone floor. Click, 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 like a countdown. Roman stood at the altar. He was dressed in a stark black tuxedo. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. As she approached, he turned his head to watch her. Again, she braced for possession. She expected him to look at her like a prize he had won. But as she reached the bottom of the altar steps, her toe caught on the heavy hem of the satin dress. She stumbled, a sharp gasp punching out of her lungs as she pitched forward. Before she could hit the stone, a hand caught her elbow. The grip was iron tight, but not painful. It was astonishingly warm. The heat of Roman's hand bled through the thick silk of her sleeve. He righted her effortlessly, holding her steady for a fraction of a second longer than necessary to ensure she had her balance. "Breathe," he muttered, so low only she could hear it. Nora inhaled sharply, smelling the subtle scent of cedar and clean soap on him. She pulled her arm away. He let go instantly, stepping back to his designated spot. The priest rushed through the ceremony in rapid, nervous Latin. He sweated under his vestments, clearly terrified of the men standing in the shadows of his church. Nora didn't hear a word he said. She was hyperfixated on the sensation of her own heart beating against her ribs, a trapped bird slamming against a cage. "The rings!" the priest squeaked. Roman reached into his pocket. He didn't produce a gaudy, diamond-encrusted mobster ring. It was a simple, thin band of platinum. He took her left hand. His calloused thumb brushed against her knuckles. The contrast was stark, his large, scarred hand enveloping her pale, shaking fingers. He slid the cold metal onto her ring finger. It fit perfectly. "I, Roman, take you, Nora." He repeated the vows in a flat, businesslike tone. When it was her turn, her throat seized. She stared at the platinum band. "Till death do us part." In his world, death was not an abstract concept at the end of a long life. It was a daily occupational hazard. "I, Nora," she started, her voice breaking. She cleared her throat, hating her own weakness. "Take you, Roman. You may kiss the bride." Nora's stomach plummeted. This was it. The public claiming. She closed her eyes, squeezing them shut, bracing for the press of his mouth, the invasion of her space. She felt a rush of air as he stepped closer. But the kiss didn't come. Instead, she felt the faint, dry brush of his lips press gently against her forehead. It lasted less than a second. He pulled back before she even had time to open her eyes. "It's done," Roman said to the priest. Nora stood there, completely disoriented. A kiss on the forehead. It wasn't a claim of a lover. It was the gesture of a tired guardian. The contradiction twisted painfully in her gut. She wanted him to be cruel. Cruelty made sense. Cruelty was easy to hate. The tires of the black SUV hissed against the wet asphalt. Rain had started falling just as they left the church, a miserable, freezing drizzle that smeared the streetlights into blurry streaks of yellow and red against the tinted windows. They sat in the back seat. The silence was so thick it felt like physical pressure in the cabin. The partition between them and the driver was rolled up. Nora sat pressed against the far door, her heavy dress consuming most of the bench. Roman sat on the opposite side, staring out the window at the passing city. He had unbuttoned his suit jacket, and one ankle rested over his knee. He looked utterly relaxed, while Nora felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. She stared at his profile, the harsh line of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken and poorly reset a long time ago. "You can take the pins out," Roman said suddenly, not turning his head. Nora jumped. "What?" "The pins in your hair. You've been wincing every time the car hits a bump for the last 20 minutes. Nora reached up, her fingers brushing the tight, lacquered updo the stylist had forced her hair into. It felt like she was wearing a helmet of wire and spray. Her scalp was throbbing. "I'm fine," she said stubbornly. Roman finally turned to look at her. The dim light from the passing street lamps washed over his face, casting long shadows. "Martyrdom doesn't suit you, Nora. We have a long drive. Take them out." He wasn't asking. With trembling fingers, Nora began pulling the heavy metal bobby pins from her hair. One by one, she dropped them into her lap. As the tension released, her dark hair tumbled down around her bare shoulders in stiff, curled waves. She let out a small, involuntary sigh of relief as the headache at the base of her skull began to recede. Roman watched her for a moment, his eyes dropping to her bare shoulders, then back up to her face. He didn't say anything. He just reached up, loosened his bow tie, and pulled it free, dropping it onto the seat between them. The car eventually turned off the main highway, winding up a steep, heavily wooded road. Iron gates groaned open, revealing a sprawling, brutalist stone house that looked more like a modern military bunker than a home. It was stark, devoid of ivy or warmth, flanked by security cameras and floodlights. When they stepped out of the car, the cold night air hit Nora like a slap. She shivered violently, her bare arms covered in goosebumps. Without a word, Roman shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The jacket was massive on her. It carried his heat, sinking into her frozen skin. It smelled of that same cedar and rain. "Inside," he ordered quietly. She walked into the foyer. It was minimalist to the point of sterility. Dark slate floors, white walls, no photographs, just shadows and angles. "Maria," Roman called out. An older woman appeared from a hallway, wiping her hands on an apron. She had kind eyes but a tight, guarded mouth. "Yes, Mr. Gallo. The master suite is prepared." "Show my wife to the East Wing guest room," Roman said. Nora froze. The guest room? Maria blinked, clearly surprised but recovered instantly. "Of course, right this way, Mrs. Gallo." Mrs. Gallo, the name felt like a parasitic insect crawling under her skin. Nora looked back at Roman. He was already walking toward a room that looked like a study, pulling the cufflinks from his sleeves. He paused, feeling her gaze. "What?" he asked, his tone flat. "We aren't—" Nora stumbled over the words, her cheeks heating with a confusing mix of humiliation and relief. "We aren't sharing a room?" Roman turned fully to face her. The distance between them in the massive foyer felt both enormous and non-existent. He looked at her heavy dress, her bare, trembling feet in the uncomfortable heels, his own jacket swallowing her small frame. "You were bought to balance a ledger, Nora," he said. His voice was soft, but it carried a razor edge. "You are here to smile at dinners and stand by my side in photographs. I do not require a bedfellow, I require an alibi." He turned away. "Lock your door if it makes you feel better. No one will bother you." The heavy oak door of his study clicked shut behind him. Nora stood in the cold hallway. She should have been thrilled. She had prepared herself for violation. She had dug her fingernails into her palms all day, repeating mantras of survival, bracing to endure whatever the mobster wanted from her body. Instead, she was discarded. A piece of furniture placed in a guest room. She followed Maria down the long, silent corridor. The bedroom was beautiful, but entirely impersonal. A massive bed, heavy blackout curtains, a pristine bathroom. As soon as the housekeeper left, Nora peeled off the wedding dress. It pooled on the floor like melted snow. She left it there. She stripped down to her underwear, walked into the bathroom, and scrubbed her face until the makeup was gone and her skin was raw and red. She crawled into the massive bed, pulling the duvet up to her chin. The house was dead quiet. No creaking floorboards, no wind rattling the glass. It was soundproofed. A tomb. She stared at the ceiling, waiting for the tears to come. Waiting for the overwhelming grief of losing her freedom to crush her. But as she lay there in the dark, the only thing she could focus on was the lingering, phantom warmth of his hand catching her when she fell, and the ghost of his jacket heavy on her shoulders. She closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath, angry at the sudden, sharp spike of curiosity blooming in the center of her chest. It was dangerous to be curious about a man who measured lives in dollars, but as she drifted into a fitful sleep, she realized the terrifying truth. The monster she had expected was entirely absent, and the man who had taken his place was infinitely more dangerous, Mornings in the Gallo compound tasted of expensive dark roast and isolation. 3 weeks bled into one another, distinguished only by the weather pushing against the bulletproof glass of the massive windows. Nora quickly learned the rhythm of her gilded cage. Roman left the house before dawn. The heavy hum of his armored SUV vibrating through the floorboards became her daily alarm clock. He returned late, long after Maria had covered Nora's dinner with foil and retreated to the staff quarters. Nora would lie awake in the sprawling, sterile guest bed, listening for the heavy click of the deadbolt and the muffled thud of his boots dropping by the entryway. Only then would her heart stop its erratic, low-grade thumping. Only then could she sleep. It was a pathetic realization. She hated that her nervous system had tied its baseline for safety to the presence of a Mafia boss. But the alternative was remembering Alex, remembering the diner, remembering the frantic scramble to hide eviction notices. Here, there were no notices. There was only silence. It was a heavy, smothering silence that made her ears ring. By the end of the 4th week, the inactivity felt like a physical itch beneath her skin. She was used to aching feet, grease burns on her forearms, and the chaotic symphony of clattering plates. This enforced idleness was rotting her brain. On a Tuesday afternoon, a persistent, freezing rain washed out the sky. Nora walked into the cavernous kitchen. It looked like a showroom. The marble countertops were pristine, completely devoid of flour dust or spilled sugar. Maria was at the sink, furiously scrubbing a pan that was already spotless. "I need to make something," Nora said. Maria stiffened, dropping the sponge. "Mrs. Gallo, I have a menu prepared for the week. If you want something specific, you only need to ask. I can make a call." "No." Nora moved past the older woman, pulling open the massive stainless steel refrigerator. "I don't want to ask. I want to use my hands. Please, Maria, let me chop an onion." Maria looked as if Nora had asked to juggle live grenades in the foyer, but she saw the frantic, tight set of Nora's jaw. Slowly, the housekeeper stepped back. "Top left drawer for the knives. The good olive oil is in the pantry." For the next 2 hours, the sterile kitchen transformed. Nora didn't cook delicate Michelin star portions. She cooked diner food. She cooked the heavy, garlic-laden meat sauce her grandmother used to make before the gambling debts ate their family alive. She hacked at onions, minced garlic until her fingers burned, and let tomatoes simmer until the air was thick with the acidic, sweet tang of basil and oregano. The physical labor was a narcotic. Her shoulders dropped, her breathing leveled out. She dragged a wooden spoon through the heavy cast-iron pot, savoring the thick, bubbling resistance of the sauce. "Maria, where did you put the red pepper flakes?" Nora called out, wiping a streak of tomato paste off her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Top shelf, left side." The voice didn't belong to Maria. Nora jumped, the wooden spoon clattering against the edge of the pot. She spun around. Roman leaned against the doorframe. He had stripped off his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing thick, corded forearms dusted with dark hair. Strapped over his chest and shoulders was a black leather holster. The heavy, matte black grip of a pistol rested against his ribs. He wasn't looking at the messy kitchen. He was looking at her. "You're home early," Nora managed to say. Her throat felt impossibly dry. She suddenly realized she was wearing a stained apron over an oversized grey sweater, her hair tied in a messy, chaotic knot. "Meeting ended abruptly," Roman said. He didn't elaborate. Given the dark, bruised look of exhaustion around his eyes, Nora didn't want him to. He pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly into the kitchen. His presence consumed the air in the room. He moved silently for a man of his size, his footsteps making no sound against the tile. He stopped next to her at the stove, looking down into the bubbling pot. The smell of him, cold rain, leather, and sharp gunpowder, mixed violently with the smell of the garlic and tomatoes. I was just making dinner," Nora stammered, stepping back, suddenly intensely aware of the gun strapped to his chest. "I can clean this up. Maria made a roast, I think." "Do you have a plate?" Roman interrupted. Nora blinked. "What?" Roman reached into the cabinet above her, his arm brushing the air inches from her face. He pulled down a ceramic bowl. He handed it to her. "I'm hungry. Plate it." Nora moved on autopilot. She ladled the heavy pasta and sauce into the bowl, her hands shaking slightly. She handed it to him. He didn't take it to the formal dining room. He just grabbed a fork, leaned back against the counter, and took a bite. Nora watched him, holding her breath. This was a man who ate at exclusive restaurants, where the waiters wore white gloves. She had just served him a peasant dish made with canned tomatoes. Roman chewed slowly. He swallowed. He looked down at the bowl, then back up at her. "Needs more salt," he said flatly. Nora felt a sudden, irrational flare of indignation. The fear evaporated, replaced by the bruised pride of a line cook. "It doesn't need salt. The pecorino cheese will salt it perfectly if you grate it over the top." Roman raised a dark eyebrow. He reached for the block of cheese on the cutting board and a microplane, dusting the pasta with white shavings. He took another bite. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a compliment. But he ate the entire bowl in a steady, methodical rhythm, leaning against her chaotic counter. When he finished, he set the bowl in the sink. "Maria doesn't cook like this," Roman noted, turning on the tap to rinse his hands. "Maria cooks for a king," Nora said quietly. "I cook for tired people." Roman's hands stilled under the running water. The muscles in his back went completely rigid. He shut off the tap, dried his hands on a towel, and turned to face her. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, piercing intensity that pinned her to the floorboards. "Get a dress fitted tomorrow," he ordered, his voice dropping an octave, returning to the cold, distant boss she had married. "We have a foundation gala on Friday. It's time they see you." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving the scent of rain and gunpowder lingering over the stove. Flashbulbs popped, turning the rain-slicked pavement into a strobe-lit nightmare. Nora sat frozen in the back of the SUV. The heavy doors were still closed, locking the chaos of the photographers outside. Through the tinted glass, she saw the red carpet leading up to the museum entrance, flanked by men in tuxedos and women drowning in diamonds. "Look at me." Nora tore her gaze away from the window. Roman was watching her. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that made the slate grey of his eyes look impossibly cold. "They're going to look for weakness," Roman said. His voice was a low, steady rumble over the engine's hum. "They're going to look at how you stand, how you breathe, how you look at me. If they think you are a victim, they will use you. If they think I pity you, they will use that, too." Nora swallowed hard. The dress the stylist had forced her into was a deep, liquid sapphire silk that clung to her ribs and hips like a second skin. It had a severe neckline and a slit that exposed a dangerous amount of leg. It wasn't a dress meant for a wallflower. It was armor. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice tight. "Keep your chin up. Do not speak unless spoken to, and do not flinch." He reached across the space between them. Nora's breath hitched, but she forced herself to remain perfectly still. He picked up a heavy velvet box resting on the seat, popping it open. Inside lay a staggering collar of diamonds and sapphires. Roman lifted the necklace. He leaned in, crowding her space. The heat radiating off him was immense. He reached around her neck, the coarse pads of his fingers brushing against her bare nape as he fastened the intricate clasp. The metal was shockingly cold against her collarbones. It felt like a chain. "Ready?" he asked, pulling back just enough to look her in the eye. "Yes," she lied. The door opened. The noise rushed in like a tidal wave. Roman stepped out first, immediately turning to offer his hand. Nora placed her fingers in his. His grip was firm, anchoring her as she stepped out into the blinding crossfire of camera flashes. Shouts erupted from the press line, voices blurring into a wall of aggressive static. Roman didn't rush. He guided her up the steps with infuriatingly slow, measured confidence. As they reached the top and handed their coats to the valet, he shifted. His hand slid from her arm and settled firmly on the bare skin of her lower back, right where the dress dipped low. Nora gasped silently. His palm was burning hot against her spine. His fingers pressed into her muscles, possessing, claiming. It was an entirely public gesture, but the contact sent a vicious, uninvited shockwave of electricity straight to the pit of her stomach. She stiffened, but he gripped her tighter, physically forcing her to relax against his side. The ballroom was suffocatingly opulent. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the sea of guests. A string quartet played in the corner, barely audible over the low, dangerous hum of conversation. "Smile," Roman murmured into her ear, his breath grazing her skin. Nora stretched her lips into a careful, vacant smile. They waded into the crowd. Introductions blurred. Politicians, judges, and men with flat, dead eyes who kissed her hand and looked at Roman with a mixture of deference and barely concealed envy. Roman played the part of the devoted husband flawlessly. He kept her close, his thumb occasionally tracing a slow, rhythmic circle on her spine that made her heart pound erratically against her ribs. An hour in, Nora's jaw ached from the fake smiles. "Roman, you look entirely too domestic." The voice sliced through the polite chatter. Nora turned. A man in a sharp grey suit stood holding a tumbler of scotch. He had slick blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach his pale, watery eyes. He moved with the loose, arrogant swagger of a man who believed he was untouchable. Roman's hand on Nora's back went completely still. The rhythmic tracing of his thumb stopped. "Dominic," Roman said. The temperature in their immediate vicinity seemed to plummet 10 degrees. "You made it out of the port." "Customs issues. Nothing I couldn't handle," Dominic sneered, taking a slow sip of his drink. His pale eyes slid over to Nora. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her collarbones, the deep V of the dress, the slit exposing her leg. The look was slimy, lingering far too long. "And this is the acquisition. I heard you cleared out a pathetic little bookie's tab for a pretty face." Nora felt her cheeks burn. The shame, which she had successfully boxed away for weeks, flared up violently. Dominic took a step closer, reaching out a hand. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Dominic Vitti. I run the southern docks for your husband." He reached to grab her hand. Before Dominic's fingers could even brush Nora's skin, Roman moved. It wasn't a violent motion. It was terrifyingly smooth. Roman shifted his body, completely blocking Nora from Dominic's reach. The action was so sudden, so physically dominant, that Dominic visibly jolted backward, his scotch sloshing over the rim of his glass onto his expensive shoes. "My wife," Roman said softly, "is not for you to touch." The music in the background seemed to fade. The polite chatter around them died down as several guests noticed the sudden, lethal tension radiating from the gallows boss. Dominic's face flushed an ugly, mottled red. He looked at Roman's face, searching for a crack, a sign of hesitation. He found nothing but a blank, predatory void. "Of course," Dominic choked out, taking another step back. He wiped his wet hand on his trousers. "My apologies to the missus." He turned and practically fled toward the bar. Roman didn't watch him go. He turned back to Nora. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped. The protective fury rolling off him was suffocating, overwhelming. "Are you all right?" he asked roughly. Nora nodded, unable to trust her voice. She felt dizzy. "We're leaving," Roman commanded. He didn't wait for her to agree. He kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, steering her through the crowd with a dark, bruising urgency. They didn't say goodbye to the host. They didn't stop for photos. When they finally climbed back into the dark sanctuary of the SUV, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them, the silence was deafening. Nora slumped back against the leather seats, kicking off her heels. Her hands were shaking violently. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around her waist, trying to stop the tremors. Roman sat beside her. He had unbuttoned his collar, discarding his bow tie. He watched her shake in the dim light of the street lamps passing by. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it was okay. Instead, he reached across the seat and grabbed her trembling hands. He pulled them away from her waist, flattening her palms against his warm, solid thighs. He covered her cold, shaking hands with his large ones, pinning them there. "Breathe," he ordered, just like he had at the altar. Nora inhaled sharply. The heat of his body seeped into her frozen fingers. She looked up at him. His face was still hard, still utterly closed off, but his thumbs were slowly, carefully stroking the back of her knuckles. It was an impossible contradiction. A monster who guarded her from the dark. And as the trembling finally began to subside, Nora realized with a terrifying jolt that she didn't want him to let go. Midnight felt heavier than usual. Nora stood in the center of the guest bathroom, her arms twisting awkwardly behind her back. Her fingers slipped off the microscopic metal pull of the sapphire dress for the 10th time. The stylist had zipped her into the garment hours ago, treating it like a fragile museum piece. Now, the silk felt like a vice, crushing her ribs. She let her arms drop, panting slightly. The cold marble floor seeped into her bare feet. She was trapped in her own armor. Nora stared at her reflection in the harsh vanity lights. Her makeup was still flawless, a ceramic mask hiding a girl who used to smell of fry grease and cheap vanilla perfume. She didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. Grabbing a heavy plush robe, she draped it over her shoulders to stave off the chill and walked out into the silent hallway. A thin sliver of warm yellow light bled from beneath the heavy oak door of Roman's study. Nora hesitated, her bare toes curling against the hardwood floor. She had never crossed this threshold. The study was the nerve center of his empire, a place where men walked in with problems and walked out with grim, bloody solutions. But the dress was cutting off her circulation, and Maria had retired hours ago. She knocked. 2 sharp, pathetic raps. "Come in." The voice was low, entirely awake. Nora pushed the door open. The study smelled of old paper, expensive scotch, and the faint, acrid bite of gun oil. Roman sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and the bow tie. His shirt collar was open, his sleeves pushed up. Spread across the desk were aerial photographs of the southern docks and a dismantled matte black handgun. He was wiping down a spring with a rag. He looked up. His eyes tracked the oversized robe slipping off her shoulders, revealing the glittering sapphire silk underneath. "I can't get it off," Nora said. Her voice felt absurdly small in the cavernous room. "The zipper." It stuck. Roman set the oily rag down. He didn't sigh. He didn't make a joke. He just pushed his chair back and stood up. "Turn around," he instructed, walking around the edge of the desk. Nora turned her back to him. The proximity of him hit her a second later, a wave of displaced air and body heat. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart kicking up that familiar, erratic rhythm against her sternum. He pulled the heavy robe off her shoulders, letting it drape over her arms. Then his fingers found the base of her neck. His hands were slightly rough, smelling of the metallic tang of the gun oil. He brushed her hair aside, the calluses scraping gently against her nape. Nora suppressed a shiver. He found the tiny metal zipper. "Breathe in," Roman murmured. She inhaled. The zipper gave a sharp, metallic whine as he tugged it downward. It parted the silk, exposing her spine to the cool air of the study, inch by agonizing inch. Roman pulled the zipper all the way down to the small of her back. He didn't step away immediately. He stood there, his knuckles resting just a millimeter above the exposed skin of her spine. The silence in the room stretched, pulled so taut it felt like it might snap. "Dominic Vitti is a dead man," Roman said quietly. Nora opened her eyes, staring blindly at the bookshelves lining the far wall. The sudden pivot from the intimate silence to a casual death sentence gave her mental whiplash. "Because he insulted you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because he looked at my wife like she was a piece of meat on a butcher's block," Roman corrected. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, which made the words infinitely more terrifying. He forgot his place. Men who forget their place in this business do not last long. You don't have to kill someone over a look, Roman. "I don't have a choice," he said, stepping back. The absence of his heat left her feeling instantly cold. "If I let a dog bite me, and I do not put it down, the rest of the pack thinks I've gone soft. They will come for my throat. And then they will come for yours." Nora turned around, clutching the loosened bodice of the dress to her chest to keep it from falling. Roman had already walked back to his desk. He picked up the rag and the gun spring. "I am not soft," he said, not looking at her. "Go to sleep, Nora." She pulled the robe tight across her chest. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was a monster, to demand he leave the violence outside their walls. But the truth was a bitter pill sticking in her throat. His violence was the only reason she was safe. "Good night, Roman," she whispered. He didn't answer. The rhythmic, metallic sound of him reassembling the weapon followed her all the way back down the hall. Shattering glass woke her. Nora bolted upright, her lungs pulling in a frantic gasp of air. The guest bedroom was pitch black, but the heavy, muffled thud of something detonating outside rattled the floorboards. Before her feet could hit the carpet, the bedroom door flew open. Roman stepped inside. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore black tactical cargo pants and a tight, long-sleeved thermal shirt. A heavy assault rifle hung from a sling across his chest. The smell of sulfur and burning rubber flooded the room, choking the clean air. "Get up!" he barked. "What's happening?" Nora scrambled out of bed, her legs tangling in the heavy duvet. "Dominic didn't wait for me to make a move. He hit the front gates. 2 of my men are dead." Roman moved to her closet, ripping a duffel bag from the top shelf. He started throwing her clothes into it, blindly. Sweaters, jeans, whatever his hand grabbed. Shoes. Now. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Nora's veins. She didn't freeze. Years of covering for Alex's sudden flights from bookies kicked in. She shoved her feet into a pair of boots, grabbed her heavy winter coat, and ran a hand through her tangled hair. "Where is Maria?" she asked, her voice cracking, as Roman grabbed her elbow, hauling her into the hallway. "Basement vault. She's secure. We are leaving." The house was a chaotic blur of shouting men and the harsh, strobing glare of security lights flashing through the windows. Matteo stood by the side exit, his face smeared with grease and a nasty, bleeding cut above his eyebrow. He held a heavy iron door open. "Perimeter is blown, boss," Matteo shouted over the din. "The armored car is hot." "Take the rear exit. Use the unlisted sedan," Roman ordered. He shoved Nora through the door into the freezing, rain-swept night. They sprinted across the wet grass, the mud sucking at her boots. A sleek, unremarkable grey sedan sat idling by a rusted maintenance gate. Roman threw her into the passenger seat, tossed the bag in the back, and slid behind the wheel. The tires spun in the mud before catching grip on the asphalt. They shot down the back access road, plunging into the dark, twisting canopy of the woods. Nora gripped the door handle, her knuckles turning white. Her chest heaved. The smell of wet wool and adrenaline filled the small cabin. Roman drove with terrifying precision. He didn't check the rearview mirror. His eyes were locked entirely on the winding road ahead. His jaw was locked tight, a muscle ticking violently near his ear. They drove for an hour in suffocating silence. The trees thinned out, replaced by the grim, sprawling industrial edge of the city. Roman finally pulled into an underground parking garage beneath a towering, decaying concrete apartment complex. He cut the engine. The silence was ringing. "Get the bag," Roman said, stepping out. Nora grabbed the duffel. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it twice before slinging it over her shoulder. They took a freight elevator that smelled intensely of bleach and old urine up to the 14th floor. Roman unlocked a reinforced steel door at the end of a flickering corridor. The safe house was a stark contrast to the mansion. It was a single, cramped room. The walls were painted a dull, institutional grey. There was a small kitchenette with a dripping faucet, a battered leather sofa, and a single, narrow bed shoved against the far wall. The air felt heavy with dust and stale ozone. Roman locked the door, sliding 3 heavy deadbolts into place. He leaned his forehead against the cold steel of the door for a fraction of a second, his shoulders dropping a millimeter. Then he turned around. "Don't go near the windows," he said, shrugging off the rifle and placing it on the small kitchen table. He walked over to the sink, turning on the tap and splashing cold water over his face. Nora dropped the bag. The reality of the situation crashed over her. 2 men were dead. Dominic was hunting them. She was locked in a concrete box with a Mafia boss. "Why didn't you leave me in the vault with Maria?" she asked. Her voice sounded hollow. Roman shut off the tap. He grabbed a paper towel, wiping his face slowly. He looked at her. In the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen, he looked older. The bruises under his eyes were stark purple. "The vault is for staff," he said. "They won't torture staff to get to me. And they would torture me. You are my wife." Nora let out a short, hysterical laugh. "On paper, Dominic knows that. Everyone knows I'm just a ledger transaction. I'm a prop, Roman. A human shield to make you look like a family man." Roman threw the crumpled paper towel into the sink. He crossed the small room in 3 long strides. Nora instinctively backed up until her shoulders hit the wall. He didn't touch her, but he caged her in, planting his hands flat against the drywall on either side of her head. He loomed over her, smelling of rain, sweat, and gunpowder. "Do you really think," Roman said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating whisper, "that I would pay $2.4 million for a prop?" Nora stared up at him, her breath catching in her throat. "Alex owed—" "I don't give a damn about Alex's gambling debts," Roman snarled. The mask was slipping. The cold, calculating businessman was gone, replaced by something entirely raw and aggressive. "I could have buried your father in the foundation of the new port and taken his life insurance to balance the books. It would have been easier." Then why? Nora whispered, her eyes burning. Why buy me? Roman stared down at her. His eyes flicked to her lips, then back to her eyes. The conflict in his face was a violent storm. I watched you, he said. The confession sounded like it was being dragged out of his chest with fishhooks. For 6 months, I sat in a car across the street from that filthy diner and watched you work double shifts. I watched you throw out drunks, twice your size. I watched you slip money into your father's coat so he wouldn't freeze. Nora's stomach plummeted. He had been watching her. Long before the meeting. Long before the ledger. You were drowning, Nora, Roman continued, his voice losing its edge, becoming devastatingly quiet. Alex was pulling you under. If I didn't step in, one of the loan sharks he owed was going to take you as collateral, and they wouldn't have put you in a guest room. He pulled his hands away from the wall, taking a step back. The air rushed back into Nora's lungs, but she felt entirely untethered. I didn't buy you to balance a book, Roman said, turning his back to her and walking toward the narrow bed. He unstrapped his sidearm, laying it on the nightstand. I bought you because I knew you had the spine to survive my world, and because I couldn't stomach the thought of anyone else having you. He sat on the edge of the mattress, burying his face in his hands. Nora stood frozen against the wall. The cynical, calculated reality she had built in her head was entirely shattered. He wasn't a cold acquirer of assets. He was a man who had orchestrated a $2 million buyout just to pull her out of the fire. She looked at the narrow bed. She looked at the exhausted, dangerous man sitting on it. Slowly, she walked across the dusty floor. She didn't speak. She just sat down on the mattress beside him, the springs groaning under their combined weight. Their shoulders brushed. Roman didn't move, but she heard his breath hitch. In the dim, flickering light of the bunker, the terrifying realization settled in Nora's chest. She didn't just feel safe with him. She was starting to feel exactly where she belonged. Rain battered against the reinforced glass of the single window, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown by a ghost. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with the scent of dust and the sharp, metallic tang of unspent ammunition. Nora sat beside Roman on the narrow mattress. The space between them was less than an inch, but it felt like a fault line. The silence in the wake of his confession was deafening. He had bought her. Not for optics. Not for a ledger. He had bought her because he couldn't stand the thought of the world chewing her up. Roman kept his face buried in his palms. His shoulders, usually a rigid line of impenetrable command, were slumped. He looked entirely hollowed out. Slowly, Nora raised her hand. Her fingers trembled as they crossed the microscopic distance, hesitating for a fraction of a second before she pressed her palm flat against the center of his back. He flinched. It was a microscopic jerk, the reflex of a man who expected a knife instead of a touch. Then, a long, shuddering breath tore its way out of his lungs, and he leaned back, letting his weight settle against her hand. His heat bled through the thin fabric of his thermal shirt, scalding her palm. "You're an idiot," Nora whispered. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual careful neutrality. "You spent $2.4 million on a waitress who doesn't even know how to fire a gun." Roman dropped his hands, turning his head to look at her. The dark circles under his eyes were stark, but the slate gray of his irises burned with a quiet, ferocious heat. "I bought a survivor," he corrected, his voice a low gravel drag. "I watched you stare down men twice your size at that diner over a $3 tip. I knew exactly what I was getting." He shifted, his knee brushing against hers. He reached up, his large, calloused hand cupping the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, rough and dry. Nora didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, leaning into the heavy, possessive warmth of his palm. The internal contradiction was maddening. She was sitting in a freezing, concrete box with a man who had likely ordered dozens of deaths, and yet she had never felt safer in her entire life. "I have to go," Roman said. He didn't move his hand. "Dominic made a play for the crown. If I wait here, he consolidates power. By sunrise, half the capos will swing to his side, thinking I'm dead or cowardly. I have to cut the head off the snake tonight." Nora's eyes snapped open. The bubble of intimacy violently popped, replaced by the freezing reality of his world. "You're going back out there." "Now?" "I am." He finally dropped his hand, standing up. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by the terrifying, predatory focus of the mob boss. He walked over to the small table, picking up the heavy magazines for his rifle. The metallic snick-clack of brass bullets, sliding into place, echoed sharply in the small room. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. "He has an army, Roman. They just blew through your compound like it was made of paper." "They blew through a gate because I had a rat on the payroll," Roman said, slapping a magazine into the rifle. He slung it over his shoulder, then checked the sidearm he had left on the nightstand, racking the slide. "Dominic is sloppy. He operates on ego. I operate on math." He walked back over to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, snub-nosed revolver. He pressed it into her hands. The metal was freezing. It felt alien and terrifyingly heavy against her palms. "Safety is off. The trigger pull is heavy, so you have to mean it," Roman instructed, his voice entirely devoid of sentimentality. He was giving her a tool to survive. "You lock the deadbolts after I leave. You do not open this door. If someone tries to breach it, you aim for the center of the mass and you empty the cylinder. You understand me?" Nora stared at the gun, then up at him. "What if you don't come back?" Roman's jaw tightened. He reached into his other pocket, dropping a burner phone onto the mattress beside her. "If I'm not back by 6 a.m., you turn that on. Press 1. A man named Silas." He paused, correcting himself. "A man named Victor will answer. You tell him where you are. He is loyal to me, and he will get you out of the country." He was preparing for his own death with the casual efficiency of a man packing a suitcase. Nora stood up. The revolver hung heavy in her right hand. She didn't look at the phone. She looked at him, at the fraying edge of his collar, the faint scar intersecting his left eyebrow, the brutal, beautiful geometry of his face. She didn't think. She just moved. Nora grabbed the front of his tactical shirt with her free hand and pulled him down. The kiss wasn't a soft, romantic collision. It was desperate. Their teeth clashed painfully. Roman groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated deep in his chest. His arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor. He crushed her against his chest, his mouth devouring hers with a starving, possessive violence. He tasted of stale black coffee, adrenaline, and rain. Nora anchored her hand in his dark hair, kissing him back with equal ferocity. She poured every ounce of her fear, her anger, and her terrifying, undeniable affection into the press of her mouth. She didn't want the polite, distant husband who kissed her forehead at the altar. She wanted the monster who burned down the world to keep her warm. Roman broke the kiss, his breathing ragged. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his lips pressing hard against her pulse point. He held her there suspended for 5 agonizing seconds, his heart hammering against her ribs. Then he set her down. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't make a promise he couldn't keep. He just turned, unlocked the heavy steel door, and stepped out into the dark. The door clicked shut, the locks automatically engaging. Nora stood in the center of the silent bunker, the heavy gun hanging from her fingers. The clock on the wall read 2:14 a.m. The waiting began. The hours bled together in a torturous, agonizing crawl. Nora didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the revolver resting on her knees, staring at the reinforced steel door. The bunker was entirely silent, save for the erratic, hissing drip of the kitchen faucet and the thrum of her own pulse in her ears. At 4 a.m., a siren wailed in the distance, lonely and shrill, before fading into nothingness. At 5:15 a.m., the old pipes in the walls groaned, shifting under the concrete. Every sound was a gunshot. Every shadow was an intruder. By 5:45 a.m., the adrenaline had completely burned out, leaving behind a nauseating, hollow exhaustion. Nora stared at the burner phone sitting on the rumpled blanket. 15 minutes. If he wasn't back in 15 minutes, he was dead. The empire had fallen, and she was a widow to a man she had just finally met. At 5:52 a.m., heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Nora stopped breathing. She gripped the revolver, her knuckles turning a bruised white. She stood up, raising the heavy barrel, aiming it directly at the center of the steel door, just as Roman had told her. Her arms shook violently. Clack! The first deadbolt turned. Clack! The second. Nora thumbed the hammer back. The metallic click was deafening in the small room. The door swung open. Roman stood in the doorway. He looked like he had been dragged through hell. His tactical shirt was torn at the shoulder, the fabric stiff and black with drying blood. His face was smeared with grease, ash, and a nasty swelling contusion along his jawline. His knuckles were split open, raw and weeping. He looked up, staring down the barrel of the revolver aimed directly at his chest. A slow, exhausted smirk touched the corner of his bleeding mouth. "Your stance is entirely too narrow. The recoil will knock you flat on your back." Nora dropped the gun. It hit the concrete floor with a heavy, echoing clatter. She didn't walk. She sprinted. She slammed into him, wrapping her arms around his waist, burying her face into his chest. He smelled of smoke, copper, and exhaust fumes. But to her, it was the best thing she had ever inhaled. Roman winced as she hit his injured shoulder, but his good arm came around her instantly, crushing her against him. He kicked the door shut behind him, leaning his heavy weight back against the steel, letting his eyes slide shut. "It's done," he murmured into her hair, his voice entirely completely spent. "Dominic is gone. The southern docks are under Matteo's control. The war is over." Nora pulled back just enough to look at his face. She reached up, her thumb gently grazing the bruised skin near his eye. "You're bleeding." "It's a graze," he muttered, though he looked pale under the grime. He had a secondary crew waiting at the warehouse. They got lucky. "Sit down," Nora ordered. She didn't sound like a terrified captive anymore. She sounded like a woman in charge of her own house. Roman didn't argue. He walked heavily over to the small kitchen chair and sank into it, letting his head loll back against the wall. Nora moved to the sink. She found a moderately clean dish towel, ran it under the cold tap, and walked back to him. She stood between his knees. Carefully, she began wiping the ash and dried blood from his face. Roman stayed perfectly still, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. He watched her face as she worked, a strange, heavy intensity radiating from him despite his exhaustion. She moved to his hands, taking his large, battered knuckles in hers, gently dabbing away the blood. The intimacy of it, washing the literal blood from a killer's hands, wasn't lost on her. But she felt no revulsion, only a fierce, protective ache in her chest. "When the banks open on Monday," Roman said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "A trust will be activated in your name. $5 million. Clean money. Untraceable." Nora's hands stilled. The cold, wet towel hovered over his split skin. She looked up at him, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "The debt is cleared, Nora," Roman said. He didn't look away from her. His eyes were dark, serious, and stripped of all armor. "Alex is gone. Dominic is dead. I have stabilized the families. You have played the part perfectly. I have a car ready. Victor can take you to the airport right now. You can go anywhere you want. You don't have to look over your shoulder ever again." He was giving her the keys to the cage. Nora stared at him. She looked at his bruised face, his torn shirt, the terrifying violence he wore like a second skin. He had ripped his own empire apart to keep her safe, and now he was offering to let her walk away, convinced she only stayed out of obligation. He was a ruthless monster to the world, but to her, he was just a man who didn't believe he deserved to be loved. She dropped the wet towel onto the small table. $5 million, Nora repeated flatly. "Yes." "And where would I go, Roman?" she asked, her voice hardening. "Florida? Paris? Buy a nice little house and pretend I wasn't married to the head of the Gallo family? Pretend I don't flinch every time a car door slams?" Roman's jaw tightened. "You will heal. You will forget." "I don't want to forget," Nora snapped. She stepped closer, invading his space, her hands dropping to rest heavily on his shoulders. "I don't want clean money. I don't want a quiet life. I want the man who bought my life because he couldn't stand the thought of anyone else having it." Roman's breath hitched. He stared up at her, the mask completely shattering. The raw, desperate hunger in his eyes was blinding. "Nora," he warned, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I am a dead man walking. I will always be a target. If you stay, you live in the shadows. You live in bunkers like this. There is no normal life with me." "I've never had a normal life," she replied fiercely. She slid her hands up from his shoulders, burying her fingers into his dark hair, tilting his head back slightly. "I don't want normal. I want you." Roman let out a jagged sound, grabbing her hips and pulling her down into his lap. Nora straddled his thighs, her arms wrapping tight around his neck as he buried his face in the curve of her shoulder. He held her with a desperate, crushing grip, as if terrified she might vanish into thin air. There were no more ledgers, no more debts, no more forced compliance. The transaction was dead. What remained was raw, bloody, and entirely real. Outside, the first faint grey light of dawn began to bleed through the filthy window, washing over the stark concrete walls. The world outside was still cold, dangerous, and waiting for blood. But inside the bunker, Roman carried her to the narrow mattress. He lay down beside her, pulling her heavy coat over them both, his large hand resting flat and warm over her racing heart. For the first time in her life, Nora closed her eyes, entirely unafraid of the dark. Thank you for watching the final chapter of Nora and Roman's gritty journey. From a terrifying debt to a fierce, undeniable loyalty, their story proves that sometimes the darkest places hold the deepest devotion. If you loved this slow-burn mafia romance and want more stories where the ruthless boss falls impossibly hard, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this with your fellow dark romance readers and leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment between Roman and Nora? Hit the bell icon so you never miss our next intense, original story. See you soon.